Okay, how are you doing? I recognize parts of it.
I've been working on it for years.
Well, actually, we've all been working on Tribute to America for years. Sometimes it hasn't turned out so good.
Well, you'll hear what I get from you.
Oh, yes. Good morning, Kiki.
I'm going to be walking out early today to go to the morning service at Audubon.
You what?
I'm going to be leaving early today to go to Audubon service.
Okay. No problem.
I'm going to walk out, you know why?
My part will be over. Just let Nancy finish before you leave. What's that?
You need this one today?
That was last week's. I forgot to take it home.
I got this.
This week is Abraham Lincoln is fitting with Memorial Day. I've got an Abraham Lincoln story that goes with Memorial. No, it doesn't really go with Memorial Day, but Abraham Lincoln does. Let's see.
Cicadas.
Yes.
Are the cicadas all the way through?
Yes, all the way through.
I thought the what? Okay, so,
Yeah, that's the last week. Next week or the week after. I don't know these people. I don't know they may be
yeah.
I can't believe that somebody has that. Even so, it's just so impressive.
Do you know what this is? Where?
Yeah, we're here about that. Although you don't hear them there.
Why
I
not?
had-
You can't hear it unless they're all in cases.
Oh,
You say in a church side?
the weird thing is there's locusts on this side.
Not yet, but it's going to come soon.
You want to hand these out?
That's Joshua.
Yeah.
Where I got it. So, you know,
No, actually, only one does. It's like this own little ecosystem up there.
but I guess they were
Yes.
through that.
And it's hard because humans want to go in.
Yes.
Like this. License and smoke. That's right. From there.
Okay, everybody crowd in, make room, find a seat.
I'm sorry, yes, yeah.
Welcome to First Universalist Church of New Madison on this Sprite Brisk Memorial Day. Glad to see everybody here. Hope everybody is having a good Memorial Day weekend where you are, if the noise isn't driving you crazy. That's what our theme today, if you haven't heard, is cicadas. All our pictures are local, and well, not local. I pulled them off the internet, but Kenny has one from a tree out in our backyard here at the church that looks exactly like one I've got one. The ground was just littered with cicada husks. So if you saw the thing on Facebook, I put a thing on that I recorded in my backyard. It's strange because you've got the birds singing in one place, you've got the cicadas, which sounds like some kind of science fiction movie, and then there's locusts on the other side, and they're like a higher pitched, like whining type sound. So if you're noise sensitive, it's like enough to drive you crazy. Okay, welcome to announcements. Do we have any announcements? Okay, let's see, talk about cicadas, Memorial Days. Oh, we have Nancy's going to be with us today on Genesis 38. I gave you a heads up on that if anybody wants to read that ahead. We have pew Bibles, but Nancy knows how reluctant we are to pull them out. So she brought handouts with everything she's going to talk about, and everybody should have one. If not, let us know. We're having good music today, special music, Memorial Day music, so I hope you'll enjoy that as well. Our welcome, Who You Are Enriches Us All by Monica Jacobson Tennyson. I've done this one before, but it's worth repeating, I think. We say welcome to your joy, your hope, your pride. We say welcome to your grief, your fear, and your anger, and the parts of you that are not yet ready to be seen and heard. Welcome to them as well. May this time together be a blessing. And the prelude is Sentimental Journey. this lighting. Get these on the switch. As we kindle this flame, may it spark in each of us connection and commitment to this living tradition and to each other. Our opening hymn is "Oh Beautiful for Spacious Skies," a really fantastic song. Pretty amazing. And did you pay attention to verse 2? A thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness, America, America. God, mend thine every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Make the people in Congress sing this every time they open the Congress. All right. Affirmation. This is a beatitude for justice builders by Lindsay Ramsden. I've done this one before too, but it also bears repeating. Blessed are you who can answer your own assumptions and listen with an open mind. You will receive new insights beyond your imagining. For we are people of faith, faith in our expansive welcome, faith in our ability to grow, faith in our precious gifts of truths, faith in the promise of trying, learning, changing, faith in our capacity to know ourselves and each other ever more deeply. Welcome to you who are gay, straight, bi, pan, lesbian, queer, questioning, unable to be contained in any word. Welcome to you who are trans, cis, genderqueer, non-binary, intersex, agender, and beyond words. And if somebody wants to tell me what half those mean, I would appreciate it. Welcome to you who are human. Welcome to you who love and are loved. Welcome to you who are blessed, which is all of you. Blessed are you who suffer the attacks of others to stand up for what is right. You will not be alone, for your courage will inspire others to rise. Blessed are you who build friendships as well as justice. Even when you lose an issue, you will have strengthened the foundation of your community. Blessed are you who take delight in people. You will not be bored in meetings. The children's story. Let me advance here. Every one of these is something I pulled off the internet on cicadas, so you're going to get your fill of cicadas, but they're still going to be around for another 2 or 3 weeks, so don't give up on them yet. Our children's story is from Abraham Lincoln, which kind of goes along with Memorial Day to me anyway. And I've kind of become a fan, or I've always been a fan. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, that was a pretty incredible movie of how the Congress works, how the law was passed to abolish slavery, which barely passed by like 2 votes, I think, and it was a strong fight all the way through. This is Crossing the River, written by Abraham Lincoln in his voice. Many years ago, when I was a young lawyer and Illinois was little settled, except on her southern border, I, with other lawyers, used to ride the circuit, journeying with the judge from county seat to county seat in quest of business. Once, after a long spell of pouring rain, which had flooded the whole country, transforming small creeks into rivers, we were often stopped by these swollen streams, which were with difficulty crossed. Still, ahead of us was the Fox River, larger than all the rest, and we could not help saying to each other, "If these streams give us so much trouble, how shall we get across the Fox River?" Darkness fell before we had reached that stream, and we all stopped at a log tavern, had our horses put out, and resolved to pass the night. Here we were right glad to fall in with the Methodist presiding elder of the circuit, Peter Cartwright, who rode it in all the weather. And as you know, they had the circuit riding preachers, which actually was through here in this area was very common as well. And actually this church at the beginning was part of that circuit. He could tell us all about the Fox River. So we all gathered about him and asked him if he knew about the crossing of the Fox River. "Oh yes," he replied, "I know all about the Fox River. I have crossed it often and understand it well. But I have one fixed rule with regard to the Fox River. I never cross it till I reach it." Typical Abraham Lincoln. Okay, joys and concerns. And Memorial Day, I think we have to say we appreciate those who have served, who gave everything, those who are still serving, and those who will serve. And we want to reflect on the reasons they had to serve, the reasons they had to give everything, and the struggle to make sure those reasons are just, that those lives are not wasted and sacrificed in vain. Anyone? Yes?
I have a short reading I'd like to share. This is in the New York Times, and I found it most interesting. I hope you will too. To the editor. Before David Brooks repeats assessments of the Unitarian Church as, quote, broadly admired, but commanding only a modicum of passion and commitment, unquote, he should read some history about it. Unitarians were leaders in the abolitionist movement against slavery, as well as the movement for civil rights in the 50s and 60s. We continue to lead on issues of social conscience in many areas, from economic justice to LGBTQ rights to Black Lives Matter. Our faith punches above its weight. 4 U.S. presidents were Unitarian, and Barack Obama attended Unitarian Sunday school. Despite Mr. Brooks's misimpression, Unitarians will continue to lead with, quote, passion and commitment to have real impact for good in the world. That came from Eric Orts from Philadelphia. He is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and worship associate at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia.
Very nice. New York Times about Unitarians, yes.
Two things. One, I am inching closer to retirement. I'm not there yet. I do have my Medicare card, so Social Security, but there's still lots of moving parts with that. I've had my last class, my last faculty meeting, last baccalaureate. So they're doing sort of a Zoom retirement on June 15th. So I still have that, but I still have lots of paperwork to get through. And when I actually moved to New Mexico, it's still an unknown. There are still lots of moving parts to that, but it's getting, like I said, inching one day at a time. So in terms of perfecting thine every flaw, so I don't know about you, but if you had asked me to name a race riot, I would have said something like Watts in 1967, or LA after the Rodney King, the officers were acquitted of beating Rodney King. Until Trump went to Tulsa a few years ago, I had no idea there was a Tulsa massacre. And I think today is the 100th anniversary of that. I had no idea that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and after World War I, that all these black communities were just wiped out by white people. They're sort of all over the sort of Midwest, southeast part of the country. And so just yesterday, because it was on the cable news show I was watching, I had no idea about Elaine, Arkansas, which again was where one of these other towns where the white folks came in as a mob and basically wiped out it was over black sharecroppers trying to unionize. And so it just reminds me of, in some ways, of how much of our history I still don't know, even though I've been, trying to learn more. So if you don't know about these things, this is a way we can continue to bend our every flaw by as white people becoming aware of these incidences in our history, and to remember that when it comes to violence, the preponderance of violence has been by white people against black people, starting with slavery. And white people say it's like, oh, well, it's so divisive to learn about these things. And I want to say, well, it's really divisive? Racism. So there's been a kerfuffle about this in Carmel outside of Indianapolis of wanting to teach some issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the new boogie word is critical race theory. Well, it's like saying, Satan worshiping pedophile. So it has the same force to it. But we still have reconciliation to do in our country. So prayers for that.
And we still know that the rewriting of history is not done yet. I mean, there's a big kerfuffle in Texas about passing laws that you can't talk about inequality and things like that, and actually outlawing it in some of the classrooms. I forget what the other one was. You can't say, does anyone remember what that was? There's a word you can't say concerned with LBGT or LBGTQ. It's pretty amazing. I'll look it up and bring it back to you next week. What is it?
Maybe queer?
No, it wasn't queer. It was a normal standard word that would normally be fine, but you just can't use it in that context. I'll look it up and bring it back to you next week, because I think it's an important note to work on. And the other joys and concerns. All right, I hope everyone has a good weekend. My family, that was a joy of mine, is my family got together for the first time in a year. My son and his wife and my daughter and her husband got together from Indiana, and well, actually both of them live in Indiana now. We had a cookout at the lake cottage. Everybody got along fine. We handed out Christmas presents that we didn't have from Christmas. and they all seem to be doing well. Yes.
Maureen, Belson, my daughter, is on her way with her partner Tim from Portland, Maine. They left from Portland, I hope, at 9 o'clock this morning and expect to be at our house tomorrow afternoon sometime. And so I'm really happy about that, and I hope their journey is pleasant and safe.
Excellent. Yes, safe journeys to everyone. And safe journeys home for my kids. And you know how you're never really satisfied with your kids? Both of my kids were here and stayed for the weekend at the cottage. You suppose either one of them, either couple, went to either my wife's church or our church, or church before they went home? Nope, shut right out. So. And I don't have to worry about embarrassing them because they will never listen to this either. So. All right, message. Nancy, as we've passed out our little thing on Genesis 38, if you had a chance to read that, I gave you a heads up on Facebook and on the internet blast, email blast. Happy to have Nancy here, and I want to say when Nancy goes to New Mexico, if we can figure out some way to do it on YouTube or just record something and send it to me, we'd still like to have Nancy make a presentation for us. We're pretty electronic. And there are people who really like the religious side of worship. I'm not very good at that. I will bring you, I told you that I would do this, and I will. I'm going to bring some of my wife's canned sermons. They are like really good in my estimation, but I'm kind of prejudiced. Religiously based on scripture and the whole thing, plus she throws in things about when we were dairy farming and milking cows and getting kicked by horses. So they're all kinds of human interest stuff. So we're gonna put in a little more religion as we go along here. All right, I'll give this to Nancy.
Did you know that I had Tara in preaching class?
What's that?
I had your wife in preaching class.
Yes, Tara actually, Tara, I say Tara, but everybody else says Tara, graduated from Earlham School of Religion.
She did.
Even though she's Church of the Brethren, she did at that time, the minister, our seminary was in Elgin, and she didn't want to take that time away. She actually started out in what they call the TRIM program, which means people who have kind of a bent for getting up in public and preaching, which if you know my wife, she preaches to me all the time. She started out basically with just her college education and went on to get her doctorate in ministry. That's something that she's devoted her life to, somewhat to the sacrifice of the other things around our house. So.
Do we have any extras of these?
Do we have any extras of the handouts?
Yeah.
So I co-taught a preaching class with Tom Mullen. May his memory be blessed. And we used to give out silly prizes, and we gave Tara a hula hoop because she was known for she would start someplace and wander around and end up back where she started. So since our theme today is cicadas, here's my cicada story. So if you go back 17 years and 17 years, that brings you to 1987. I had just driven from Carrizozo, New Mexico to Princeton, New Jersey. I was going to be starting summer German, was the first thing I was going to do to start my doctoral program at Princeton Seminary. So I pull into Princeton Seminary and park on the street across from the library, and I could hear them before I got out of the car. They were so loud. So I'm sitting in the car, and all I could think of was the beginning of the book of Joel, which chapter 1, verse 2 is this whole series of locusts. And it's like, what this locust doesn't destroy, the next locust will destroy. What that locust doesn't destroy, the next locust will destroy. What those locusts leave, the next group will just totally wipe out. Now, I now know that cicadas are not locusts and are not destructive in the way of locusts. But that's all I could think of sitting in my car and thinking to myself, it's not too late. I could just turn the car back on and turn around and go back to New Mexico because I'm thinking this is not a good sign. But I got out of the car and they were awful in Princeton. You would crunch on them because they were all over the sidewalk. They'd drop in your hair out of trees and they stink to high heaven. I mean, they were horrible. So there's something about that my career is being bookended by Brood X. Make of that what you will. So I always think if I can't remember if I've talked about something, you probably can't either. So I don't know. Is that rude? I don't know that I've ever talked to you about Genesis 38, which is my favorite Bible story. And so I thought I can't like leave you without having talked to you about my favorite Bible story, right? So this is the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38, which is embedded in the Joseph narrative. Genesis 37 is when Joseph has his dreams and his brothers get annoyed and toss him into a pit and he gets sold to traders. And if you actually go to Genesis 39:1 from the end of Genesis 37, it's like you can just continue the whole Joseph story without just flipping right over chapter 38. Well, part of the reason chapter 38 is there to remind us that even though Joseph takes up the entire rest of the book of Genesis from chapter 37 to 50, except for this one chapter, it's really Judah in the larger history of ancient Israel. That is the tribe that matters. And you'll find out why Judah matters as we go on. So, do you remember me talking to you about gaps in the text? Does that ring a bell somewhat? A gap is a place in the text where we think information is missing. And our brains want to fill that gap. And my students sometimes think I'm against gap filling, and it's like, I can't be against something you're going to do anyway. What I want you to do is, to know there's a gap there. It's amazing how, because so much of what we've been told is actually about filling in the gaps. And that's what we're so used to hearing, we can't even see that there's a gap there until someone points it out. Now we have different ways we might fill that gap. Some are more persuasive than others. But the point is because the information isn't in the text, you can't actually prove that your way of filling the gap is like the only way to do that. So there could be other ways of filling the gap. So going through this, one of the things that I want to point out are where some of the gaps are. Okay, so we have Judah, who is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. He's fourth born, and is one of again, all the 12 sons of Jacob, who was renamed Israel. These are the 12 tribes. So Judah is not only one of Jacob's 12 sons, but the progenitor of the tribe of Judah. So Judah went down with some of his brothers and settled near a guy whose name was Hira. I guess Judah and Hira were BFFs. So Judah saw a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and went into her. Now, okay, so we know Judah married a Canaanite. Awkward. We don't know her name. We know she was the daughter of a guy named Shua. And they have 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. So Judah marries off his eldest son to a woman named Tamar. We don't know if she's Canaanite. We don't know if she's Israelite or Dulamite. We don't know her. We know nothing about her background. We just know that her name is Tamar, which means date palm, by the way, if you were wondering. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord. We don't know what did. That's a gap. It just said was wicked and God smote him. Because that's the kind of thing God does to people who are wicked. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother." You might think like, what? So if you go to page, like the bottom of the next page, I have Deuteronomy 25 printed out. So I'm only going to read Deuteronomy 25, 5, and 6 at this point. When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother
so that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. That assumes that that firstborn will be male. So this is all tied into inheritance issues, where the system in antiquity was eldest son inherited. Younger son's bubkis. You know, this is also, this has been the way even in the Western world until the last century, where eldest sons inherited. Okay, so the idea is that if eldest son dies, but no son has been born, now it doesn't matter if a daughter has been born, then the next youngest son has intercourse with his sister-in-law, and assuming that's a male, that offspring will be counted as the heir of the firstborn who had died. Very complicated. But Onan, so that would be Onan, knew that the offspring would not be his, so he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went to his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. And what he did was displeasing in sight of the Lord, and God smote him. It's sort of like King Lear at the end when everybody's dying. But, so, I don't know if you've ever heard of onanism. This is the verse where the church for a long time was its basis for forbidding masturbation. So his spilling the seed to the ground, it's sort of coitus interruptus, but, you know, male seed that doesn't do anything is considered a bad thing. So lots of weird things around sex, but that onan in particular is known, so onanism is basically another word for masturbating. So can I say that word in church?
Yes.
Because I just did, so. I also said semen, so you know, my flippant answer when people ask me why I do, you know, got into First Testament, I said, well, sex and violence, what's not to love? So, see, we've already had both, sex and violence, right? Now, so Judah's looking around and 2 of his sons are dead. So in his mind, what's the common denominator in both of those? Rather than thinking, oh, maybe it's the son's fault, he basically blames Tamar, sort of viewing her as sort of a black widow kind of thing. So he says to Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Now, for a woman, Tamar is now in this liminal space, because basically a woman is supposed to be either a virgin daughter in her father's house or married, living with her husband, having sons. Well, Tamar's a widow, but she's still of childbearing age. She's not a virgin, obviously. So really, like, she shouldn't be living in her father's house. And so the whole rest of the story is about, so women in liminal spaces, first of all, makes the patriarchy very nervous. And so the whole rest of the story is to try to get Tamar back into an acceptable box for the patriarchy. But what also happens is somehow the patriarchy is willing to tolerate interesting things happening in liminal spaces that they would not tolerate under normal circumstances. So let's see what happens. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died, and when Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Anaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. Now, there are a couple of things you need to know in that verse. First of all, the rest of Deuteronomy 25, starting with verse 7. But if the man has no desire to marry his brother's widow, Then his brother's widow shall go up to the elders at the gate. And so you know where the gate of the city is? It's the entrance of the city. My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and speak to him. If he persists, saying, I have no desire to marry her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and declare, this is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And throughout Israel his family shall be known as the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. Sometimes the Bible is really funny. But you should know, the woman has rights. She has the right to basically go to the elders and say, this man is not fulfilling what he's supposed to do, so either force him to or release me from being bound to this family. So one question, so why does Tamar go to the entrance to Anayim? So it doesn't tell us why she does that. That's the gap. So the way I fill the gap is with Deuteronomy 25. She's going to the gates, and when Judah comes by, she's going to gather up the elders who are sitting there and demand her rights. Now, so the next verse, Judah saw her. He thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Now, I want you to think of cultures in our world where women are veiled. Are they prostitutes? No. Pretty much prostitutes, you want to be able to see the merchandise. But what had she done? She had put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up. Well, the only other, so again, what does that mean, what she's doing? The only other place where like veil and wrap yourself up occurs is with the story of Rebecca, who marries Isaac. Abraham's servant had gone back to the homeland to get a wife for Isaac, and it turns out it was Rebecca. And after all the negotiations, as they arrived back in the Holy Land, Rebecca sees Jacob, sees Isaac, and asks who that is. And the servant says, well, that's who you're going to marry. And so she wraps herself up in her veil. Is Rebecca dressing as a prostitute? No. So what Tamar does is she takes off her widow's clothes and puts on her get ready to be married clothes. Just like Rebecca did as she went to meet Isaac and become his wife. So the change of clothing is sort of removes her out of the status of widow and puts her in the status of like, I'm ready to be married to Shayla, and you need to do right by me. It is Judah who perceives her to be a prostitute. And every commentary you read will tell you that Tamar intended to act as a prostitute. And I bang on the table and tell my students, Tamar did not intend to act as a prostitute. She took off her widow's clothes, put on her get married to be ready clothes, and went to the entrance of the city to demand her rights. Judah perceives her to be a prostitute because she had covered her face. It's like, well, and it's like, so again, let's fill some gaps here. Why didn't Judah recognize her? And it's like, well, you know what it's like when you like run into your dentist at the grocery store? And you're sort of like, God, that person looks familiar, but they're so out of context for you, you don't recognize who they are. And actually throughout these first chapters in the Joseph story, the idea of recognizing and not recognizing is woven throughout the story. So it picks up a theme that's in the Joseph story. But it's like, she was a daughter-in-law. I mean, how much attention did Judah pay to her to begin with? I mean, it's like, even if she had been sitting there, naked, would he have recognized who she was? So that's one of the gaps is why Judah didn't recognize her. So the text says, well, because she had her face covered. It's like, she's been your daughter-in-law for how many years? Really? But anyway, so he went over to the road and said, come, let me go into you. for he did not know it was his daughter-in-law. She said, well, what will you give me that you may come into me? So the real gap in this story is why Tamar went along with the proposition. Now, the way I feel that gap is thinking, well, it's not like she's gotten a real great shape from this family at all, right? So maybe it's like, well, so I haul him up before the elders. Are they gonna actually do right by me or not? Or is Judah gonna talk him out of it or whatever? And so, okay, so maybe this is a bad decision, but it's like a decision she makes. And he answered, well, I sent you a kid from the flock. And she said, only if you give me a pledge until you send it. So he's like, oh, well, I'll pay you later. She's like, I need some collateral here. What pledge shall I give you? She replied, your credit card, your driver's license, and social security number. Basically. So your signet, your cord, and your staff. So all of the symbols of his economic, social status. And he said, okay. And went into her, and she conceived. And she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. So she goes back to her previous status. Now, again, this kind of behavior would not be tolerated by the patriarchs, right? but wait. So then Judah tried to go pay her off, but instead of him going, he sends his friend Hira. And Hira goes back to the town and says, where's the holy woman who is at the gate? And they said, no holy woman has been here. So the Hebrew word is kedeshah. Forever it has been translated as cultic prostitute. There was no such thing as cultic prostitutes in ancient Israel or in Canaan. This is, again, to call someone a cultic prostitute is sort of, again, the equivalent of Satan-worshipping pedophile. It's a way to dismiss, denigrate the practices of other people. And it's mostly a fantasy of white male biblical scholars. That this is a real thing. But the Hebrew word kedeshah just means holy woman. And there's actually a related word in Akkadian, and if you look at all the Akkadian texts that deal with the kedeshah, like none of them involve prostitution. She apparently had a variety of roles within various temples. So my sense is Hira is trying to make Judah look good, like he's paying a vow he had made to a holy woman on his way to sheep shearing. And the people's like, yeah, no kedeshah here. So he's trying to make Judah look good as opposed to like praying off a prostitute, right? And so he goes back to Judah and says, can't find her. And Judah says, well, let her keep those things, otherwise we'll be laughed at. It'll look bad, so we'll just pretend it didn't happen. But then, 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has apparently prostituted herself, and moreover, she is pregnant. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, it was the owner of these that who made me pregnant. And she said, take note, please. Whose these are, the signet, the cord, and the staff? Whoops. And Judah acknowledged them and said, she is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not lie with her again. So that she is more in the right than I, the Hebrew word is tzedakah. So if we think of justice and righteousness in the Bible, the word for righteousness is tzedakah. So if you were to take Judah and Tamar into court and say, who was right? Judah's saying, she is the one who did right. Now, my mentor, James Sanders, always said we need to theologize before we moralize. What he meant by that is to moralize is to say, oh, let's all go have sex with our father-in-law so that we can be declared righteous. Like, no, not the point. The point of theologizing is to say that look at this thing that happened in this very unusual circumstance. And perhaps righteousness may not always look like what we think it should look like. We normally have an idea of what righteous behavior looks like. Well, Tamar, doing the nasty with your father-in-law is not in anybody's normal book of righteous behavior. And yet Judah is forced to say, she is more righteous than I. And so when the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took it and bound the hand in crimson, saying, this one came out first, so we know who the elder one is. But then he drew back, and out came his brother. And what a breach you have made to yourself. Therefore he's named Perez. Perez, because the word for breach is paraz, so it's a play on the Hebrew word for breach. And then afterward, his brother came out with the crimson thread, and he was named Zerah. Now, this story gets pulled into the rest of the Bible in several ways. So I say, see Ruth 4:12. So if you go to page 4. So the story of Ruth. So Ruth and Boaz have gotten married. Ruth has conceived, born a son. But well, actually before that, before Ruth conceives, they've gotten married, and all the people say, and through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now, the son born to Ruth and Boaz is called Obed. And at the end of Ruth, you have this little genealogy. Now, these are the descendants of Perez, who was born to Tamar. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. King David. That's an interesting genealogy. And then we get to the Gospel of Matthew, who gives the genealogy of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And Matthew, before he gets to marry, lists 4 women from the First Testament. And they are not Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, who you might expect to be that the matriarchs of Genesis would be named. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Amram, blah, 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 and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, Rahab the Canaanite prostitute of Joshua 2 of Jericho fame, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. So why do we have Tamar, Rahab, Ruth the Moabite, and Uriah? Those are the 4 women named in Matthew's genealogy before Mary. Now each of those women, okay, so we know what Tamar did. And again, we don't know if she's Canaanite, Israelite, whatever. Rahab is clearly Canaanite. Now, in the text of Joshua, she's never married off to anyone. And the later tradition marries her off to all kinds of people. But it is claimed that Boaz's mother was Rahab. Because Ruth is set in the time when the judges were judging, which is right after the story of Joshua. And then Ruth, who we know was a Moabite. And then Bathsheba, who was raped by David and had her husband murdered. And so why these 4 women? And there's lots of speculation. One thought is that, well, Jesus was going to be born of a somewhat irregular union. And here are all these other somewhat irregular unions that have led to King David and now to Jesus the Messiah. which again forces us to think about what does righteousness look like. So I've nattered on too long. So I guess I'll leave you with that thought.
So do you think this...
So I've never seen this performed like as a youth group play.
Not in a sex ed class either.
One of my students in her reflection was like, I was shocked at like how much sex there was in the Old Testament.
Well, that would be my question. Do you think this intricate, convoluted, kind of salacious creation was done on purpose, or was this just kind of people writing down things that either they wanted to occur or that did occur, or, I mean, because Judaism is filled with legalisms, which is the one thing I bring away from it. I still can't get past the story of...
Jewish legalism has nothing over Christian legalism. But I
Old,
understand.
Old Testament being Christian, and I understand that. I can't get over the thing. I think it was in Brooklyn or someplace where they put strings on the light poles so they could walk places on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always, if you're inventive and creative and willing to bend the rules a little bit, there's always an answer. Mm-hmm. Is this something that's just kind of intuitive? It's like born into the people that came from the Mediterranean?
So, you know, the issue of the story of Ruth is that Deuteronomy says, no Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord to the 10th generation. Well, Ruth is only 3 generations away from David. Like, oh, awkward. So in some ways, it's like this whole, why this is my favorite story is because it sort of pokes at the dominant story and makes you realize just how leaky the dominant story is and how unenforceable it is. And so what that means is we end up with Canaanites and Moabites in the family tree that says none of those things should happen. So, you know, Deuteronomy says, don't ever marry a Canaanite. What does Judah do? Marries a Canaanite. You know, so again, this idea that the Bible is sort of having a conversation within itself. And again, you can read lots of things that justice and righteousness are and are not. So you might think of like, who in our world or else in history, who are the other Tamars in the world who have sort of found themselves in that odd liminal space? Yeah.
Yeah, the other Tamar, the one that I was familiar with, was from Samuel, the one that gets raped by David's firstborn son. And
yes, the other Tamar. The other Tamar, yes.
And I'm looking, I'm going, wait a minute.
Yes, there are 2 Tamars, yes.
Okay.
Yes, you are not crazy. No, okay. that is the case. There are 2 Tamars, yes. We can talk about that story sometime.
There's another, you know.
Yes, another connection,
Another sexual situation.
Right. So, since I don't actually know when I'm moving, as long as I'm here, I can talk about something else.
Well, let's hear about Job, since God is smiting those who are innocent, or maybe not so innocent.
I keep thinking there's a little smiting that needs to go on around here, but...
All right. Anybody else have a question or a comment?
I want to talk later about how gaps are resolved.
How gaps are resolved, all right?
Through the academic, theological, and ancestral basis.
Something to look forward to. Does everybody know what this is? You're already laughing, so I assume you know what this is.
Yeah, the Skippy Star had recipes.
Yes. We have a surfeit of cicadas. They're said to be pretty nutritious. So this is one of the recipes where you can eat your cicadas. If anybody wants the recipe, I'd be glad to pass it on to you. I have not tried it myself. Yes.
Are you sure you want to make a steak right before the offer?
That's kind of why I put it in the offering.
Is that avocado?
I'm not sure exactly what it is because there was no description there, but I could tell it was food. I was trying to decide whether that was figs or applesauce or, you know, what the topping is. Yeah. The only thing is, every time I look at a cooking show, they get like weirder and weirder and weirder, and they only give you little tiny portions. Just give me meat and potatoes and carrots. And all right. Our offering statement. We give by Kristen Collins. We give to remind ourselves how many gifts we have to offer. We give to remember that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. We give because we believe in music and sacred space. We give with the faith that together we have enough. You're invited to drop whatever you like in. If you need something, take it out. If you're online and want to send us something or drop it through the little hole in the door, feel free to do that. That was the music we're playing, which was that was also very enjoyable. Okay, the closing hymn is Battle Hymn of the Republic. We're going to do 3 verses, correct?
Yes.
3 verses.
5, 6, and 7.
5, 6, and 7. Okay. Yeah. great Civil War musical rendition. Remember, patriotism can be used by anyone. The Confederate side was just as patriotic as the Union side, so use your patriotism judiciously and don't let it be hijacked by someone that tries to railroad you in the wrong direction. That's in my opinion. Cicadas are not always a problem. They're beneficial for some. This is a tortoise eating cicadas and a bluebird. So good for the cicadas that they're sacrificing for our benefit. Closing words, Power at Work in the Universe by Tom Shade. My friends, there is a power at work in the universe. It works through human hands, but it was not made by human hands. It is a creative, sustaining, transforming power, and we can trust that power with our lives and with our ministries. It will sustain us when we take a stand on the side of love, whenever we take a stand for peace and justice, whenever we take a risk. Trust in that power. We are together held by that power. And our postload, Tribute to America. This was a fun one. They were practicing it earlier, and I really enjoyed it, so I hope you do too. Medleys,
What do you got?
The whole thing was difficult.
medleys are,
Five flats.
yes.
Oh, okay, because it all sounds very
I
difficult.
play it every year, but it's been a
Well, medleys are a killer because they're joined together at awkward places, and it's not the net. They change everything every time, and we really appreciate the effort that goes into this, and much rather hear you play this than somebody playing something canned. So, all right, that ends our service on this Memorial Day. Please hold your patriotism dear and hold on to what we would call the real patriotism. Don't be deceived by the false idols, the false gods, the golden calf, so to speak, if you saw the thing at the convention.
Everybody up until you.
That'll be it for today.